All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our SMA INSS PRISM speaker session entitled Responding to China, the Case for Global Justice and Democratic Socialism. I'd also like to thank today's speaker, Professor Thomas Piketty, for taking the time to present today. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping items. So we'll be having a Q&A session at the conclusion of today's brief. So during the presentation or during the Q&A, go ahead and submit your questions through ZoomGov's chat function. It's the chat icon at the bottom bar of your screen. Also, go ahead and submit all of your questions today to Ms. Mariah Yeager. Her name should be listed as questions-Mariah Yeager, and questions that aren't submitted to Mariah specifically may not be addressed, so go ahead and send those questions to Mariah. Also note that your name is going to appear in the chat before your question, and it'll be read out loud before we address that question. If you prefer for your name to not be recorded and on the record, go ahead and rename yourself by going to participants at the bottom bar of your screen, then more next to your name, and finally rename. Lastly, we're going to ask that you keep your video and audio off for the duration of this event. Those who don't do so will be removed from the full event, so please keep your video and audio off. So now I'm going to briefly turn the floor over to Mr. Michael McCloudzik, a INSS Senior Fellow at the National Defense University and the Editor-in-Chief of its PRISM Journal, to kick off today's event. So Mr. McCloudzik, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this session of the PRISM INSS Speaker Series, supported by the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment Team. During the course of this series, we've addressed three main themes: great power or strategic competition, emerging disruptive technologies, and geoeconomics, or how economic factors and economic policy can affect national and international security. To provide diverse perspectives on this third line, and of course, presenting diverse perspectives is what a university is supposed to do, we've had such distinguished speakers as Nobel Prize-winning economists Joseph Stiglitz and Paul Krugman, former Treasury Secretary Jack Lew, former US Trade Representative and World Bank President Bob Zoellick, and the father of geoeconomics, Edward Luttwak, all joining us and sharing their time and insights with us on a pro bono basis. Our featured guest speaker today is Dr. Thomas Piketty, dialing in from Paris. Dr. Piketty is a professor at France's School for the Higher Studies of Social Sciences and at the Paris School of Economics. His bio is posted on the session announcement for additional background. He's the author of Capital in the 21st Century, of Capital and Ideology, and of A Brief History of Equality, among other books, all published by Harvard University Press. Books that have provoked significant debate and introspection among economists and that reveal the tensions between two of our most cherished principles: free enterprise, or capitalism, and equality. It hasn't gone unnoticed by many across the political spectrum and around the world that capitalism without guardrails has not been equally beneficial to all. Substantial income and wealth disparities within and between countries have left many feeling abandoned by systems that they feel are fixed to benefit only elites. Growing disenchantment has led to instability in many countries, even leading to questioning democracy as a good form of governance. This puts at risk not only our national security, but the security of the rule-based system that we've been trying to put in place for the past 70 years. In the last 20 of those years, China has emerged as a great power and global rival. China contests our worldview and offers a competing model for world order. We cannot take the world order we have for granted. This is not a time for arrogance, but for adaptation if we are to meet China's challenge. Dr. Piketty has a theory of how we can meet that challenge. He will speak for around 40 to 45 minutes, with the rest of the time allocated to discussion, questions, and answers. As Nicole asked, please mute your microphones and turn off your cameras in order to ensure quality transmission. During Dr. Piketty's remarks and during the following discussion, please feel free to send your concise questions to questions Mariah Yeager in the chat function. With that, Dr. Piketty, if you're ready, the microphone is yours.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Nicole and Michael, and you know, I'm very glad to be with you today. So let me try to share my screen to make sure that you see what I have to say. So if that's okay with you, I think you can see that. Michael, is this okay? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so so this is the topic of the day. Very big question and very big statement, and I don't know how much I will be able to deliver with such an opening statement. But basically, here is what I'm going to try to do in this talk. So I'm going to argue. I'm going to make 3 points in this presentation. The first point is going to sort of come back to the history of equality and inequality, and I will argue that over time, what we have seen, in particular in Western countries, both in North America and in Western Europe, is a very successful historical movement toward more equality through, in particular, the rise of the welfare state and progressive taxation over the course of the 19th and 20th century. So I will argue that this has been very successful, and that this movement toward more equality in the long run has been absolutely central in the success of the Western model in general, the Western democratic model in particular, and also in the rise of modern economic prosperity. Then my second point will be that, I think it will be desirable collectively to continue moving in this direction. And, I will argue that, moving toward what I call a model of participatory and democratic socialism based on a permanent circulation of power and property via progressive taxation and workers' rights will be the right way to go, by sort of taking the institutions that were successfully built, in particular during the 20th century, in terms of progressive taxation, more workers' rights, and sort of try to continue in this direction. So this system of democratic socialism that I described, can seem very, very strange to many of you. But what I will argue is that the transformations that we have seen in the past of our economic and social system have already been considerable. So when we compare capitalism today with capitalism in 1910, these are really two very different economic systems. And so, the kind of democratic socialism systems that I have in mind, assume it will be in place in 2050. What I will argue is that, of course, it's very different from the kind of welfare state capitalism or social democratic capitalism that we have today and that we've seen in place since about 1980, 1990 in a large number of Western European countries and to some extent North America. But in a way, it will not be more different to these systems than these systems of social democratic capitalism is different from the kind of colonial capitalism systems that we had in 1910. So, if we take this long-run perspective on the transformation of economic system and legal regime and property regime and fiscal system, I think the evolution is going to continue, or at least I will argue that it's desirable that it continues. Then my third point of the talk, which is more closely related to the issue of China and world competition for power, will be asking, okay, assume that this is desirable, assume that I have convinced you about point 1 and point 2, what will be the forces of change, going in this direction? Because of course you always have a very strong resistance of elite and people in power against this kind of transformation. And I will argue that, I can see at least two big forces that can push in this direction. One is going to be global warming, which I think, is going to transform attitudes toward the economic system, toward inequality in a way that can be quite spectacular. And the second one will be, I think, the competition with China. And I will try to argue, in the conclusion of this talk, that, in my view, the right response to China and more generally to autocratic system in China, Russia, or wherever they come from, is actually for the West to pursue the movement toward equality and global justice. So, this can involve a number of new steps, and I will mention we're talking a lot about what kind of sanctions against Russia these days. I will argue that sanctions against top wealth oligarchs rather than uniform sanctions that will eat the full population or the full economy are desirable. Sharing of global tax revenue and a different kind of reform of, for instance, multinational taxation of multinationals and the one we had last year, I think will be desirable. And so I will say a bit more on this in the conclusion. So let me say that I'm going to cover quite a lot of material in this talk. If you want to know more about what the materials that I will cover in this talk, you can have a look at my book Capital and Ideology, which is a bit long to read, unfortunately. And if you don't have time for this, I suggest that you have a look at my new book, A Brief History of Equality, which actually will be published by Harvard University Press in next month, I guess, or in early April. So you cannot order it yet, but it will soon be available. I mean, it's already available in a number of other languages, including French and Spanish and German and Italian and other languages, but in English, you have to wait until early April. And, in this brief history of equality, I try to sort of summarize some of the bigger lessons from my previous book. Also, I think I try to clarify, by writing a much shorter book, which was very interesting for me. I could, clarify some of the message, and in particular, I insist in this new book, A Brief History of Equality. I insist much more than in my previous work on this sort of optimistic dimension and this movement toward equality in the long run, which I should stress, is a movement that is not something that comes naturally or spontaneously. This is a product of revolution, big social struggles, big political mobilization, including geopolitical tension and international tension. And so this movement toward more equality in the long run is something that started, say, by the end of the 18th century with the end of aristocratic privileges, which you can see during the French Revolution and to some extent during the US Revolution. This is a movement which starts also with the slave revolt in Haiti, in Saint-Domingue at the end of the 18th century, which is sort of the beginning of the end of slave and colonial societies. And then this movement toward more equality continues in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and is still continuing today with big collective mobilization like Me Too or Black Lives Matter or other environmental mobilization. And so this movement, my main point in this book is that it's going to continue. It's not going to stop there. And if we want to understand the next steps, probably the best thing we can do is to look at the previous evolution. So if you want to know more about the sort of the general framework, you can have a look at these books. You can also have a look at the World Inequality Report 2022, which was just published a few weeks ago by the World Inequality Lab. So this is a very collective global project involving more than 100 researchers from all over the world, and I will present some of the findings from this report in this presentation. You can also have a look at the World Inequality Database, which is by far the largest existing historical database on the long-run evolution of inequality of income and wealth, both within countries and between countries. And a lot of the data that I'm going to be presenting comes from this big collective work. So let me start right away with examples of the kind of inequality data I have been working with in the past. So this is an example of one indicator of inequality which you can find in the World Inequality Database, which is the share of national income going to the top 10%. So just to clarify the orders of magnitude, if we had complete equality, the share going to the top 10% of the population should be 10%. And if we had complete inequality, it should be 100%. So in the real world, of course, we are always in between 10 and 100. But as you can see, it can actually go from 20, 25 to almost 65–70%. So the most equal country will be Scandinavia, typically, where it will be around 25%. And the most unequal country will be countries like South Africa or Brazil. South Africa, it will be up to 65–70%. So it doesn't go from 10 to 100, but it goes from 20 to 70. So you have huge variation in the level of inequality across the world. It's even more striking, maybe, if you look not at the share going to the top 10%, but the share going to the bottom 50%, which in a way is even more important because that's what's closely related to poverty, social unrest. And so, again, if you had complete equality, the share going to the bottom 50% should be 50%. And if you had complete inequality, it should be 0. Now, in practice, it's always in between 0 and 50. As you can see, it can go from sort of 5 to 25–30. So, the most equal country, which would be again Scandinavia, it will be 25–30%, say about 25% of total income going to the bottom 50. So of course it's less than 50% because after all they are the bottom 50%, but they get 25% of total income. This means that on average they get an income which is about half of the average national income of their country. So of course they are poorer than average by definition, but they are not that much poorer. I mean, they are poorer, but they are only they have half of average income. Whereas in South Africa, where you will get 5% of total income going to the bottom 50%, it means that on average they will get only 1/10 of average income. And in Latin America, or in some of the most unequal countries in Latin America, it will be between 5 and 10%. So to summarize, again, you have a huge variation in the level of inequality across the world. And what you should remember, the first sort of takeaway from this is the distribution of income, matters a lot in the sense that, for a given average income, for a total, aggregate GDP per capita in your country, the average income of the bottom 50% of the population can actually vary from a factor of 1 to 5, depending on whether the share of the bottom 50% is 5 or 25% of total income. So just looking at aggregate GDP is not enough. That's not giving you a good view of the actual living conditions of very large segment of the population. And that's going to be very important for political revolt, political revolution, social unrest, and that's absolutely key. Now, in the long run, as I said, there is in Western Europe and in North America an historical evolution toward more equality, in the sense that in the 19th century or in the early 20th century, we were closer to South Africa or say Latin America. It was a share, the bottom 50% share was close to 10%, and today it's more 20–25%. So there's been a big improvement in the share going to the bottom, and a significant decline of the share going to the top 10% that used to be, say, 50%, and today it's more 30% or even 25% in Scandinavia. So there's been a movement toward more equality. If you want, Sweden used to be more like Latin America and has become Sweden over the course of the 20th century. And this movement toward more equality of income in the West, has come together with a movement toward more economic prosperity, the rise of parliamentary democracy, and, by and large has been an incredible success. Now, what I want to talk about now is to argue that if you look not at the inequality of income, but inequality of wealth, the progress in the long run has been substantial also, but more limited than for income. So here I show you the case of France, for which we have very good historical records, starting with the French Revolution. But in fact, we have similar data for all European countries for which we have data, and to some extent for the US as well. So what you can see on this graph is that over the course of the 20th century, the share of total wealth owned by the top 10% has declined, mostly to the benefit of the next 40%, whereas the bottom 50%, basically, they still don't own much. So you can see here that inequality of wealth, so wealth is what you own in terms of assets, real estate, business assets, land, financial assets, net of debt. So the distribution of wealth is always more unequal than the distribution of income. So remember, for income, in European countries today, the top 10% will be 30% of total income, and the bottom 50% will be 20-25%. Well, you can see for wealth, it's much more concentrated. The top 10% owns, say 60%, and the bottom 50%, most importantly, basically does not own anything. So you can see today, in a country like France, it will be 4% of total wealth. It was 2% in the 19th century. So, there's a progress, but, it's limited. Now, it's not only in France, more generally, I will argue that we observe throughout the world, and in particular in the West, a sort of persistence of hyper-concentrated wealth. So here, I show you the evolution of Europe between 1913 and 2018. So, you have a movement toward more equality in the distribution of wealth, but the bottom 50% still does not own anything. In the US, in fact, the share going to the bottom 50% is even smaller than in Europe, and the share going to what I call the patrimonial middle class, which is the group that is in between the bottom 50% and the top 10, which is, I think, very important politically. And I think, the rise of this patrimonial middle class over the course of the 20th century has been very important, both in terms of, economic growth, because these are, more people who can participate to the economy, create firms, purchase a home for their family. But this has also been very important politically to, sort of strengthen the democratic Western model. Unfortunately, in recent decades, the share going to the bottom 50% and also the share going to the next 40% has actually declined substantially in the US. It used to be more like Europe, and you can see today it's actually sort of intermediate between Europe today and Europe in 1913, and it's not moving in the right direction. Now, this is something that you observe throughout the world. So this graph comes from the World Inequality Report 2022, and you can see that in every region of the world, the bottom half, the poorest half, owns always less than 5% of total wealth. So it's going to be maybe 2% in Latin America, but in Europe it's going to be 4%. So it's more, there's a bigger share in Europe than Latin America, but by and large, you have enormous concentration of wealth, which is also an indicator of the concentration of economic power and economic opportunity in terms of setting up firms and developing a new economic life for you and your family. So the question is, how can we improve this? And my way to address this question is, how did we make progress in the past? And because, as I've shown you, it was even worse 1 century ago, and we've moved toward more equality in the long run. And what I argue is that the rise of public social spending in the long run, in particular public education and public health, has been very important in the movement toward more equality. So in particular, so here this is for Europe. In the US, the rise is a bit less spectacular in the long run, but you also have an enormous rise, both in the US and in Europe. Total educational spending was very small until World War I, and in the 19th century, it was like less than 1% of national income in the US, less than 0.5% of national income in Europe before World War I. And at the time, the US had a big educational advance over Europe, but it was still very small educational spending as compared to today. And over the course of the 20th century, total public educational spending has been multiplied by 10. it used to be, say, 0.5% of national income. Today, it's 5 to 6% of national income. So, and it has been multiplied by 10. And this has been a very important, both in the rise of more equal distribution of resources and economic opportunities, and also in the rise of economic growth and economic prosperity. Now, it's going to be the same in the future. And one of the problems we have today in the West is that if you look at total educational expenditures, they have actually been stagnating in the past decades, whereas in some countries in Asia and possibly in China in the future, they might actually increase even more, their investment, and that's going to be absolutely key for the competition in the future. And I will argue, invest, more investment in public infrastructure, public health, and in particular public education is really the key for both for equality and for prosperity and for the world competition in the future. Now, another lesson from the 20th century is that this rise of social spending and social investment, has come with the rise of progressive taxation. So let me remind you, for those who don't have this in mind, that in particular the United States was very much the country that invented very progressive taxation in the 20th century. So it started in the 20s, but it continued under Roosevelt, and on average in the US between 1930 and 1980, the top income tax rate applying to the very highest income was 81%, and this is only the federal income tax. Apparently this did not destroy US capitalism, otherwise we would have noticed it. And in fact, if anything, this was the period of maximum domination of the US economy over the rest of the world. This is the time when the productivity gap between the US and the rest of the world is the largest. So, there are several important lessons from this observation. First of all, I don't think you need an income gap of 1 to 100 or 1 to 200 in order to get economic growth. I'm not saying you want complete equality. Maybe you need an income gap of 1 to 5, or some people would say 1 to 10 or 1 to 20. I think 1 to 5 is enough, but in any case, 1 to 50 or 1 to 100 or 1 to 200, if I look at my historical evidence, compare the different countries, I really don't see any rationale for that. The second lesson is that the true key for economic prosperity in the long run has much more to do with education. And if the US economy and if the US as a country were a leader during the 20th century, it is because it was an educational leader. In the middle of the 20th century, in the 1950s, you have 90% of a generation going to high school in the US at a time when it's only 20 or 30% in Germany, France, or Japan. And you have to wait until the 1980s, 1990s to get convergence of Western Europe and Japan to US educational levels, and this is when you get also the convergence in economic productivity, and that's really the key lesson. Let me also stress, sometimes when people hear about this top income tax rate, they say, well, okay, but it did not apply to anyone. In fact, it did. If you look at the effective tax rate, so if you look here at the top 0.1% income or top 0.01% income, which will be, the top 10,000 income earners in the US, or the top 100,000 income earners in the US at mid-20th century, you see effective tax rate of 60, 70, 75%. So this was, this was real, and I will argue that this was in fact a big success historically in this country. You have also a progressive taxation of inherited wealth, which you can see on this graph, where again, it's interesting to see that countries like France and Germany never went as far as US and to some extent Britain and Japan for progressive taxation of wealth. Partly because war destructions and inflation did a lot of the redistribution. I think progressive taxation is a more civilized manner to do it, and was very successful in the past. In terms of economic growth, let me also remind you that the per capita national income growth in the United States was about 2.2% per year between 1950 and 1990. This was sort of in line with the 1910-1950 period, and a bit better than 1870-1910 period. But as you can see, the big rise of progressive taxation did not prevent very high growth from happening. And when top income tax rate were divided by 2, this was supposed to boost innovation and growth, but in fact the growth rate have also been divided by 2. Now, I'm not saying that the growth rate were divided by 2 because top income tax rate were divided by 2, but at least what you should infer from this is that in itself, high tax progressivity is not detrimental to growth, and cutting top income tax rate in itself is certainly not a sufficient condition to boost growth. In the end, the missing variable here, I think, again, is education. And I think it's really the stagnation of educational investment in recent decades, which also explains the stagnation of growth and the big success of growth in the mid-century. Now, in terms of wealth, as I argued, we still have a very high level of concentration of wealth. In particular, the bottom 50% owns very little, both in Europe and in the US, it's even less than in Europe. So what kind of new step toward more equality can we imagine in the future? What I argue here is that the ideal way to go would be to have a redistribution of inheritance. I think you have lots of children who are born in the bottom 50% or even middle 40% who have lots of great ideas to create firms, to take economic initiatives, and have almost zero wealth. And you have lots of rich children who don't have such great ideas and I believe receive too much inheritance, and redistributing this inheritance will allow us to continue in the direction of more equality, more prosperity. So I'm not saying that's going to be an easy transformation, but if we don't do something like this, it's quite likely that the concentration of wealth will remain very large. And the view that we should just wait for economic growth and market competition to spread the wealth, well, we've been waiting for 2 centuries since the Industrial Revolution, and as I argued before, the share of total ownership going to the bottom 50% is less than 5%. So just waiting for another couple of centuries might not be sufficient. The other important dimension of the model of democratic participatory socialism that I have in mind is to extend the system of workers' rights that we already have in a number of countries. So here I start from the experience of Germany and countries like Germany and Sweden, where, as you may know, starting in the 1950s, representative of workers in Germany have 50% of voting rights in boards of corporations, and shareholders have only 50% of voting rights. Well, in fact, shareholders have 50% plus 1, they have the decisive vote. But this means that if workers, in addition, own 10 or 20% of the stock of their company, or if a local government or regional government, like in the case of Volkswagen, owns a share of 10 or 20% of the stock of the company, then together with the 50% of the vote going to workers, they can shift the majority against a shareholder that will have 80 or 90% of the stock of the company. So as you can see, this is still capitalism, but this is quite a different kind of legal system than the standard one share, one vote. And I will argue that this has been largely successful. I think in countries like Germany and Sweden, and more generally in Nordic Europe and Central Europe, this has come together with a better long-term investment of workers in the long-run strategy of their firms. And of course, shareholders don't like that. Initially, they didn't like that in Germany in the 1950s, but today nobody is trying to change this system. And so, shareholders in my country, in France, don't want this to happen. Shareholders in the US or in Britain don't want this to happen. But I think, in the long run, this is actually desirable. And I will argue that it's possible to go even further in this direction by having, so what I propose here on this graph is to have a system where in large companies, there is a maximum of voting rights going to a single shareholder. The general idea is that we live in very educated societies where lots of people can participate and can contribute to economic decision making, and this kind of monarchical view of economic organization where one individual can concentrate decision-making power for decades and decades, I think is completely out of touch in a way with the reality of the societies in which we live. So now the last part of my talk, is the conclusion of my talk is going to be about, okay, what are the forces, in particular at the international level, that can make this kind of transformation continue, this movement toward more equality to continue in the long run, for instance, through the kind of transformation I just described. Well, I will argue that there are at least two forces that can play a very important role. One is global warming, and the other one is the competition with China. So global warming and inequality are two very closely related subjects, in the sense that if you look at the global distribution of carbon emission, you can see on this graph that this is very concentrated in certain countries, and within these countries, it's very concentrated within certain groups. So you can see that North America in practice, this is mostly the United States. Canada is also included here, but most of it is really the US. So North America concentrates, it's about 20% of global carbon emissions over the past decade. But in fact, if you look at very high levels of emissions, so emissions that are higher than 9.1, the global average, then they actually concentrate more than between 55 and 60% of those emissions. So that's quite spectacular, and I think when people, this is something that everywhere in the world, I think, is very much aware that rich countries, and in particular the US, have enormous share of the responsibility in historical carbon emission. And when the concrete consequences of global warming will become visible, well, they are already visible, but they will become even more visible as time passes, and when they become really catastrophic for large part of the world population, I think this will affect the perceptions of the world economic system, and can we continue to have free trade, free capital flows, with countries that have contributed so much to carbon emission? How are we going to affect this? So I think this is going to raise huge, transformation in the perception of the world economy at the international level. And at the domestic level, I also want to stress that, within each country, you have enormous inequality in carbon emission. So here I have put, East Asia, Europe, North America, South Asia. You have in the world. So this comes again from the World Inequality Report 2022. You have the same for all other parts of the world and all individual countries. So as you can see, if you look at the bottom 50% of Europeans, or actually North Americans today, so take the bottom 50% of Europeans, their average carbon emission right now is about 5 tons per capita. Now, this should decline toward 4 or 3 or 2, but this is already this is not so much, this is already more or less in line with for instance, the official European targets for
Professor Piketty, are you there? Oh, all right. It looks like our speaker has lost connectivity. Oh, Professor Piketty, are you there now?
Yeah, I'm there.
There we
I don't
go.
know what happened.
Okay.
Okay, can you still see my screen?
Yes, we're able to see your screen now.
Okay, I don't know what happened, but something happened. But anyway, okay. So what I was saying is that any solution to our environmental challenges that will ignore this enormous level of inequality in carbon emissions, I think is not going to work, because if you ask for people in the bottom 50%, in Europe or in the US to reduce their carbon emission by having enormous energy taxation or carbon taxation, these people are going to tell you, like the Yellow Vest movement in France, well, look, you should first ask to people at the top, who have a huge carbon emission, to reduce their emissions. But I'm not, I'm only having small emissions as compared to this group. So I think any proportional carbon tax or any target to reduce everybody at the same in the same proportion, is not going to work. So that's my first point. Is okay. If we want to address global warming and environmental challenges, we'll have to address the inequality challenges as well. And I'm not saying the bottom 50% won't have to make any effort. They will have to also change their lifestyle, but you will have to ask much bigger effort to people at the top. Otherwise, nobody will accept any change. Now, the other factor which I think will contribute to this transformation is the competition with China. So here, what I want to stress is that the Chinese model of sort of state socialism, or very centralized socialism, which the Chinese Communist Party pretends that is in place in China, of course, looks more and more like a perfect digital dictatorship to a big part of the public opinion around the world. So I'm not saying the model has obvious limitations, and many people in the world don't want their country to become like this. So there are big limits to their power to sort of convince other people to do like them. But at the same time, they have a number of serious strengths. Both sort of economically, politically, and from sort of a more moral viewpoint. One is going to be regarding global warming, that they will be able to point the historical responsibilities of the West. And I think if we don't have serious compensation policy for the South, this will be very difficult to counteract. Two, they have, the government in China and the public sphere in China in general has enormous financial capacities, and so this is what I want to summarize on this graph. On this graph, you have the share of net public property, net public wealth in national wealth. So you can see that in the US or in Britain, it's actually negative, and it has gone towards zero everywhere in Western countries, which corresponds to a situation where you privatize public assets and you increase your public debt. So when it's negative, it means that you have more public debt than public assets. So I don't know what's the optimum share of net public wealth in national wealth, but when it gets to negative level, this is really very small, and this limits the ability of government to invest in the environment, in education, in all these challenges. In China, it has, the share of net public wealth has declined, of course, since the 1980s because of privatization, and by and large, this was successful. But what I want to stress is that this share has sort of stabilized around 30%, since the 2008 financial crisis, which means that the Chinese state has sort of stopped its privatization program since then. So in fact, this 30% of public share in total wealth should be viewed as the average of, it's only 10% in the housing sector, so 90% has been privatized, but about 50% in the company sector. So when we talk about national wealth, it's about half housing, half company sector, to summarize, to simplify. And so in the company sector, which is sort of the most strategic in a way, you have the ownership structure in the next graph, and you can see that, the share of the Chinese state has sort of stabilized over 50%, which is a lot. And in fact, the rest of the world has declined in the past 10 years, and Chinese households have increased a little bit. So what I mean here is that, the Chinese system, in spite of all its, problem and the fact that it looks more and more like a perfect digital dictatorship to to many people in the world, has a lot of strengths, in particular in terms of financial capacities. And so, what I want to argue is that, we should take it seriously. And what I will argue, in conclusion, as I've already said before, is that, in my view, the right response to China and also to Russia and to all autocracies in the world is actually to continue the long-run movement toward equality and global justice that has happened, in particular in the West, over the past centuries. And just to take two examples in the current public discussion, instead of having uniform trade sanctions or uniform financial sanctions, like, for instance, the suggestion to have a disconnection from SWIFT for applying to Russia, which is going to affect negatively, everybody, all businesses dealing between the West and Russia, and all workers in these companies. I think we need to think about a new kind of sanctions targeted against oligarchs, high wealth individuals who have benefited a lot from the regime. Now, we've already started doing that a little bit with Putin and a small number of people close to Putin, but I think it's too small a group, and it's easy actually to use other people to keep to pursue the ownership of these assets, and I think this needs to be done in a much more systematic way through this requires the development also of more financial transparency and of a global financial register, which I think will be also very important to fight corruption and other problems in the world. So if we were to target, say, all Russians or all Chinese who own more than 10 million euro, which would be about 20,000 Russian individuals if we look at if we use the data from the World Inequality Database, I think this would have a strong, a much stronger impact in the end than the kind of uniform, across the board sanctions that we've used after 2014. And let me remind you that these Russian very high wealth individuals own a very large share of their wealth, in fact, in London, in Paris, in New York, in the West. And so in a way, there's a lot of hypocrisy, to just, we are part of the system. We are part of the system that has benefited, people close to this regime. And, I think if we want the message about democracy and justice to be credible around the world, a system of sanctions that would be targeted on high wealth oligarchs, I think, would be more credible. And just to conclude with another example, which in a way is even more important, when you think of the discussion about the reform of taxation of multinational corporations, which happened last year, one of the big limitations of the discussion was, well, first, the 15% minimum tax rate was too small, in my view, but what was even more problematic is that it was more a north-north arrangement with sort of countries, rich countries, sort of splitting between themselves the tax base that was located in tax havens, and countries in the south basically got nothing at all. And I think we really have to think for the next step on public discussion on international tax reform of a system where we share in effect at least a fraction of global tax revenue paid by the world's most powerful and prosperous economic actors, multinationals, billionaires, between all countries according to population. And again, I think if we let China pay for the investment needs of countries, whether it's in Mali or Afghanistan or sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia or all the way, that's very that's, I don't think this is the right way to approach the problem. And so we need to offer a more convincing alternative model of development based on this lesson, historical lessons of this movement toward more equality and global justice that I have been describing in this presentation. So thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm very glad to answer questions now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor. Over the last 20 years, the United States and our Western allies and partners have been preoccupied with what was once called ungoverned spaces, Afghanistan, Somalia, South Sudan, places like that, as potential cultivators for terrorism and insurgency. And a tremendous amount of effort and energy was put into trying to create better governance, better economic conditions in those countries. Do you yourself see any or have any evidence of a direct correlation between economic or wealth inequality and instability or conflict?
Oh yes, there's no. In my view, it's clear that extreme inequality is really what's behind a lot of chaotic political situation, social unrest, but it's been like this forever all over the world. The French Revolution, to take an example, was a consequence of extreme inequality, if you wish. So it's always been like that, and I was. Just before the COVID started, I was in Bamako, in Mali, to develop a project on, digitizing tax declaration with the tax administration in Bamako. And, this is part of our work trying to improve transparency and how to measure inequality of income and wealth in a country like Mali. And in this case, the problem was just that the raw material, were missing, in the sense that the tax administration did not even have, the resources to just digitize the tax declarations that they were receiving from companies and individuals. And when you visit one of these places, I remember going to different part of the administration in Bamako with some friends from Mali, and people were telling me, well, look, we are supposed to send this Excel file to the World Bank, showing what we've done with respect to poverty, but we were not even able to pay the teachers last year in the country, the nurses in the country. So, you can ask them to fill Excel file as much as you want, but, the sort of the basic fiscal resources to make, property titles respected, to pay for the schools, to pay for the most basic, public infrastructure, public services, are not there. And I think of course the process of state construction and construction of a legitimate state administration, is a very complicated and long-run process everywhere in the world, and it's been very complicated historically in Europe as well. But I think when you are in an international legal environment where you have a system of free capital flows with no fiscal counterpart, with no collective counterpart at all, it's very difficult because that's a very good system for people who want to move around their wealth between Bamako and Paris, and for people who have wealth, people who have assets and who want to avoid taxation, whether these are corporations or individuals, whether these are individuals from Europe or from Mali or from West Africa. For all these people who have assets, this is a great international legal order. But for a government that wants to build a state capacity and a fiscal capacity, how can you convince your population, to pay tax if everybody knows that people at the top, can just press a button and transfer their assets in Paris or London, and nothing has been planned to just recover these assets and make these people, pay their fair share. So I think inequality, and more specifically, this international economic and legal system where we just don't pay attention at all to the process of state construction and in the south, is feeding not only inequality, but it's feeding chaos, basically, and that's what we have today. And it would not cost very much. When I was mentioning at the end, I think it would just if it's only a fraction of total tax revenue on the largest multinational in the world that will be shared, where between all countries, which historically all countries have contributed to world prosperity and to since the Industrial Revolution, and I think we are all in the same planet, and if we don't have this kind of mechanism to share more resources, I'm afraid the kind of chaotic situation coming from extreme poverty and extreme inequality will continue.
Thank you, Professor. Just to go a step further, teasing out the relationship between wealth and inequality and conflict. In the bottom billion, Professor Collier tells us that instability and conflict don't result from poverty alone, but from poverty coupled with low growth. Does this align with your own thinking and your own findings?
Yeah, definitely. Historically, growth comes from equality, or at least growth comes from a more, inclusive, access to basic goods, in particular, education and basic public infrastructure and health. Again, the reason why the US as a country, was an economic leader during, the 20th century, or most of the 20th century, was because the country was a leader in education, and not only a leader in education for a small elite or small part of the population, but in a sort of very inclusive manner. I was mentioning the fact that in the middle of the 20th century, 90% of the cohort will go to high school in the US. At the time, it was 20 or 30% in Western Europe. But it was already the same in the 19th century. The US was a country, in spite of slavery, but if you focus on the white population, this was a country where already in 1850, 90% of the population will go to primary school. In Europe, you have to wait until 1900 or 1910 to get the same universal access to primary school. So this is this sort of educational advance of the US and relative equality in access to education, which has been key historically. And I'm afraid that sometimes today we tend to forget these lessons from the past. And so coming back to your questions, I think for poor countries today, very extreme inequality and very poor living conditions and opportunities for the bottom 50% is part of what explains also the very, very low growth performance of some of these countries.
Thank you, sir. A question from my colleague from National Defense University, Mark Phillips. In a new book, Reclaiming Populism: How Economic Fairness Can Win Back Disenchanted Voters, Authors Eric Protzer and Paul Somerville argue that focusing on inequality as the driving factor behind populist insurgencies is mistaken. In their view, economic unfairness is a closer approximation to what's at stake. What's your response to that critique?
Yeah, no, of course, it's economic unfairness. In itself, the inequality in itself is not a problem. The question is the magnitude of inequality and the justification of inequality. So, if inequality benefits everyone, then that's great. So, let's take an example. In the United States, when top income tax rates were divided by 2, in the 1980s. So, they used to be, so as I said, the top income tax rate was over 80% on average between 1930 and 1980, and it was reduced, down to 28% with the Tax Reform Act of 1986, and then it's sort of stabilized between 30 and 40%, but so roughly it has been divided by 2 in the 1980s. Now, the claim that was made at the time, the Reagan claim, if you want, it was to say, look, maybe this is going to increase inequality, but in fact, this is going to increase innovation so much that, the size of the pie is going to increase so much, the growth rate of the US economy is going to increase, and, the average, the income and wages of average Americans is going to increase so much that, in fact, this is going to be in the benefit of everybody. Now, if this had been true, of course, there will be no problem with rising inequality as such. The problem is that it was not true, in the sense that if you look at the growth rate of the US economy, it has been divided by 2. The growth rate of national income per capita in the US between 1990 and 2020 was a bit more than 1% per year, as compared to 2.2%, between 1950 and 1980, or 1950 and 1990, which, this post-war period was exceptional in Europe, but in the US, it was not particularly exceptional. As I've shown you before, it was the same as 1910, 1950, or 1870, 1910. So what was exceptionally bad was the recent decades. And so I think it's important to ask, from a factual viewpoint, what did it work? And my answer on the basis of the evidence I have is that, it didn't work. And this is where inequality becomes unfair or unjustified or illegitimate. So I perfectly agree with the author of this book that what matters is the fairness or unfairness of inequality, not the inequality in itself. But as a matter of fact, my point is that this level of inequality that we've seen in the US in recent decades, has not been in the general interest. In the same way that, the level of concentration of wealth that we had, in France, either before the French Revolution or in Europe in the 19th century, until World War I, was not in the general interest. People already at the time said, okay, what matters is not inequality, it's unfairness. And in fact, this very high level of concentration of wealth is in the general interest because it serves more innovation, more growth. But in fact, what happened in the 20th century is that you had a huge decline in this concentration of wealth. You had a movement toward more equality. And this has also been good for economic growth. So the conclusion is that the initial level of inequality was not only very high, but also not in the general interest, not in the interest of the poorest group in society, and therefore unfair. So I fully agree with the point about unfairness. Where maybe I disagree with some of the analysis of this book is about the actual, historical analysis of what are the levels of inequality that are fair or unfair. But this is a complicated discussion, and I don't pretend that I have a magic mathematical formula, to determine the tipping point. But at least, I'm trying to bring a lot of historical evidence and quantitative evidence and comparative evidence from all over the world to try to compare the different levels of inequality, economic growth across societies. I think this is the best we can do, and that will never be sufficient to settle all of our disputes, but at least maybe we can reach a more informed discussion.
And the social science thanks you for that. And probably fair to say that no complicated social outcome is the result of a single factor, whether it's inequality or unfairness, but many factors combined. Larry Kuznar noticed that in your graph of inequality through time in France, the middle class share of wealth rose rapidly in the mid 20th century, but has stagnated since 1980. And he asked, do you think that the stagnation in the middle class improvement could be at the root of counter-establishment movements such as the alt-right globally and Yellow Jackets in France?
Yes, very much so. I think in France and in other European countries and in the US, the fact that since the 1980s, 1990s, we've been a rebound of inequality, and the fact that the historical long-run movement toward more equality has been stopped or at least interrupted for the time being, is at the origin of a lot of the political frustration that we've seen. So, I mentioned the Yellow Vest movement, and, so I think this frustration is going to be exacerbated further and further by the policy discussion around carbon taxation and energy taxation in the coming years. And, I think if government, either in France, Europe, the US, continue to come with solutions like a proportional carbon tax or proportional energy tax, eating the poor and the rich at the same rate. And in fact, the poor at an even bigger rate because they tend to spend a bigger fraction of their income in energy. That's not going to work. If you are in the middle of a trend toward rising inequality, where top income groups and top wealth groups are getting a bigger and bigger share as compared to bottom groups, and in addition you try to tax more the bottom groups by energy consumption, even if you have a good justification in terms of climate, that's not going to be enough. So you have to articulate this with, I think, a message about equality and inequality, and in substance you have to ask a lot more to people at the top. Now, in terms of frustration and rise of populism or right-wing xenophobic movement, I think what has happened in the US is interesting. I think it's in the 1980s, at the time of Reagan, there was this sort of optimistic belief that by cutting tax on the rich, we will boost economic growth, boost innovation, everybody will benefit, middle-class Americans will see their income and wages rise like they've never seen. The problem is that this is not what we've seen. And so beginning, around the time of in 2000 or 2008 with the financial crisis, people, middle-class Americans, started saying, well, look, we didn't see this big, income growth that we were told would happen because of this. And I think this largely explains, the rise of kind of political discourse that we've seen with part of the Republican Party, and in particular with Donald Trump, basically saying, oh, okay, well, this is because basically the rest of the world, people from Mexico, people from China, or people from all over the world have sort of taken away, the economic growth and US wealth creation. And so if you have a tough leader, who's going to fight for you against people from all over the world, who they are, things are going to improve. And the problem is that this didn't work, and I don't think this is going to work. But I think this kind of attitude is to a large extent, the consequence of the failure of Reaganism and the promise of higher economic growth that were made at the time. So yes, I think these phenomena are very related, both in Europe and in the US.
Sir, DD asks or begins by saying that arguably the vast wealth that is being taxed originates from liberal democracy and free market capitalistic systems. And she points out, or he points out, that China would not be where they are today without the free market economies of the West funding their economic systems. Do you have a comparison? Can you compare your position compared to less taxation and an expansion of the free market as advocated by people such as Frederick Hayek and Adam Smith?
Yeah, it's again, all countries that are rich today, like, including countries in Western Europe or a country like the United States or Canada, have gone through an enormous expansion of taxation and public spending in health and education and, public spending in general over the course of the 20th century. There's no example in any of these countries of a country that has tax revenue, say less than 10% of national income, which is what we had in all of these countries in the 19th century or before World War I. Today, all of these countries are between, say, 30 and 50% of national income tax revenue. And, I don't think there's any significant political movement in any of these countries that's proposing to go back to, tax revenue of less than 10% of national income. So, some people may dream about that, but, I don't think this is significant. I think people, by and large, have understood that, this is, the rise of prosperity came with the rise of the social state and large public involvement in a large number of tasks. So you can, the rhetoric sometimes can be a bit different, but if you look at the substance, in the European Union, we have 27 countries, and we used to have 28. We have 27 countries. If you look, the very low tax countries are Bulgaria and Romania, where total tax revenue are between 10 and 20% of national income. And, the very high tax country are Denmark and Sweden, where it's between 40 and 50%. So, do you want to leave Bulgaria or Romania? If it was enough to have small tax to be rich, Bulgaria will be richer than Sweden. And so, I think at some point it's important to be practical. Hayek, could not see this kind of evidence. Hayek made lots of mistakes. If you read, again, and I ask you to read, if you've not read it, The Road to Serfdom that was, published just at the end of World War II. Hayek, in this book, was telling his friends in Britain and his friends in Sweden, please don't vote for the Social Democratic Party in Sweden. Please don't vote for the Labour Party in Britain, because these parties are going to lead you to totalitarianism and misery. Now, ex post, if we look today to this kind of claim, the least we can say is that this was not very visionary. And, especially for someone who then supported the Pinochet dictatorship in the 70s and 80s, I think it's difficult to make this judgment when you are in the middle of the history. And I think, Hayek was sincere that he really thought that the Swedish Social Democrats and the British Labour Party will fail. But, look, the National Health Service that was put in place by the Labour Party in Britain in 1945, today, even the Conservative Party, they want to increase the social contribution, that are going to put more money into the National Health Service. At the time, they said it was communism, like Hayek. So, things change, and, I think there are lessons to draw from this.
Commander Wes Hawkins from the US Navy says, you've mentioned several times that education is the driver to wealth creation. What role do you see for government in not only promoting education, but in promoting education in areas that boost a nation's ability to create wealth?
No, that's it's a very good question. I think the challenges posed by higher education are more difficult than those posed by primary and secondary education. So at the time of primary and secondary educational expansion. In a way, it was relatively simple in the sense that there was a general objective, which was to get everybody there. You want to get 100% of a generation at the end of primary, and then 100% of a generation at the end of secondary, and you want a curriculum that is more or less the same, or at least you have a certain number of sort of minimum skills which you want more or less everybody to attain. For higher education, obviously it's not, you're not going to get 100% of a generation with a PhD, and even if you get there, you're not going to get everybody with the same PhD. So you have a diversity in what the content of education, which is a strength, which is very important, but which makes it also more difficult for governments to intervene. So I think we need a lot of decentralization. We need universities and schools of higher education, to work in a very decentralized manner so that they can adapt to the needs of their students, to the need of the labor market. And I think sometimes what's missing in many European countries is that the system of higher education are a bit too centralized and state controlled, and you have not enough sort of responsiveness and not enough decentralization. So, I am for a very decentralized system. This is why I talk about participatory socialism or decentralized. I have. Now in the US, you have in many ways more decentralization than in Europe in the higher education sector, but you have enormous inequality. So the very top universities are fantastic in many ways, but the bottom half or bottom 2/3 of the US population, not only they don't go to Harvard, but the kind of university or community college they go to, did not receive the kind of public investment that they should have received in recent decades. And I think that's a big part of the explanation for rising inequality in the US, also for diminishing rate of growth. So I think we have to imagine a system of public funding of higher education, which at the same time are based on a sort of very decentralized decision-making process where universities are largely in charge of designing their curriculum, offering new degrees. And so we have to combine Europe and the US in many ways. And I think no country has invented the perfect system, and no country is in a position to give lessons to others and say, well, okay, just do what I did. And so we have to look, I always try to look at the US, at Germany, at Sweden, at Japan and France in a sort of trying to see what we can learn from each model to try to combine the benefits from decentralization and autonomy at the local level with the other objective of equal access, or at least not too unequal access, in particular to education.
Thank you. G.K. Allen Jr. asks, how will democratic socialism strengthen the states in the free world against our strategic competitors? Aside from a universal basic income, will there also be a need for mandatory public service? Will such service prevent such things as January 6th or the Yellow Jackets?
Yeah, I was not thinking of a mandatory public service, but let me say, since you're asking the question, that what I put under the label of democratic socialism and participatory socialism, if you prefer to give it a different name, and if you prefer to talk about social democracy or advanced welfare state capitalism, I have no problem. I'm not here to be to do the police of language and to tell people what words they should use or not. I think the word socialism is can still be used. I think it has been it has been misused and used again and again in history, but in the end it has been damaged less badly than the word communism, and I think the word socialism can still be used, and many people use it, including in the United States. But if some of you don't want to use this word and want to use a different word to refer to the same kind of economic system, economic ideas that I am describing, this is fine with me. I have no problem with this. My view on the word socialism and capitalism is that, in practice, there are so many varieties, so many different versions of capitalism, socialism, that, we should not be obsessed with one word. What I put in terms of content, because in the end, this is what matters. In terms of content, there are maybe 3 ingredients which to me are very important in the system that I call democratic socialism or participatory socialism. One is this, equal access to education and very advanced access to education. The other one is the redistribution of income and property. So, basic income, is very important. Minimum wage is very important, but redistribution of inheritance so that everybody has a minimum wealth, is also very important, because that's going to have a huge impact on the distribution of economic opportunities, the distribution of bargaining power. When you don't own anything, you have to accept any job, any wage, any working condition, because you have to pay for your rent, to pay for your family. If you own just even a few $100,000, rather than zero, you can create a firm, you can buy a home, you can take your time to see what you're going to do, you can think about the future. It puts you in a different position with respect to the rest of society. So that's, together with equal education, more equal distribution of wealth is absolutely key. So this is the second ingredient. And the third ingredient is what I was describing before as the stronger involvement of workers and stronger workers' rights in the governance of corporation. And again, let me say that this is, based on the lesson from history, this is working. The countries that have given more workers' rights, so here, and I mentioned in particular, Germany, Sweden, with up to half of voting rights in the board of large corporations going to worker representative, even in the absence of any share in the capital stock. I think this has been largely successful. And, I can tell you, I know, shareholders don't like that, don't like to hear about that in the US or in Britain, or actually in my country, in France, shareholders have been saying forever, okay, workers, representative, these people are terrible, workers should demonstrate in the streets, they should shout and cry, but, we don't want them in the boardroom. We don't want them around the table. We don't want them to look at our books and our little secrets. But, for a number of years now, people have been telling these shareholders in France, well, look, this is what happens in Germany. In Germany, workers' representatives have access to the books as they are around the board. And, this seems to be working at least as well as in France, and probably better, because in fact, the fact of having access to information and giving some voting rights, forces workers' representatives also in a way to be more responsible, to try to design some strategy okay, they disagree with the plan presented by the board. Well, they need to come with another plan and to say what's their long-run strategy for the firm. But you cannot just protest in the street. You need to come with a plan. So I think in the end, this is positive for everybody. So these are, the key ingredients, education, redistribution of wealth, and more workers' rights and sharing of power of companies that I put into the label of democratic socialism. Again, you want to call it social democracy, you want to call it advanced welfare state capitalism, please, I have no problem with this.
Professor, the last question will be from Professor Walt Hudson, my colleague at the Eisenhower School here at National Defense University. Given the difficulty differentiating where the public ends and private begins, how do you differentiate Tencent and Alibaba from China? How do you act against a Chinese firm without acting against China, the country?
That's that's going to be difficult, and I'm not saying I have the perfect answer to this. I will say it's probably better to try to target the individuals, and in particular the high wealth individuals, rather than the companies, and rather than the consumers or the workers as a whole. And so, this is what, this is the idea that I was sort of describing with what I was saying about sanctions against oligarchs. Now, this will require a lot more transparency about who owns what that we now have. But, I think it would actually be desirable for its own sake to have this extra level of transparency. What has happened over time is that in a way we have privatized, the registration of property titles when it comes to financial assets. So, we have a number of private financial institutions, called central security depositories, which are Clearstream, Eurostream in Europe, or the Depository Trust Corporation in the United States, which in effect keep track of who owns securities around the world, which is a very useful public service, because it's very difficult to conduct business if you have two individuals in the world or two banks in the world who claim that they own 100% of Alibaba. So you need to have someone who keeps track of who owns what. But this has been largely privatized, and I think we will need public authorities to have this information. I think we are moving in this direction, in the sense that we now have system of automatic exchange of information about cross-border financial ownership that have been developed since the 2008 financial crisis. But I think we are not there yet. And if we had made more progress in this direction, then we will also be able to target sanctions against very high wealth individuals in China or Russia, which are people in power, people who have control rights in the economy, and which are also people who have benefited from the regime. And I think in the end it will be much more powerful as a tool to put pressure on the government of these countries. Now, one reason why we may not do it is because wealthy individuals in the West, may be afraid that with such a system in place, in the end, they would also lose from that. And because indeed, this will simplify the implementation of progressive wealth tax and progressive taxation in the West as well. And so I think that's going to be one of the key issue why it's going to be a big battle. But in the end, I think this is in the general interest. Let me just conclude by saying, in the case of the US, there was this study that was published by ProPublica before the summer last year, where they had access to the federal income tax returns of the top 400 billionaires in the US, and the general conclusion was that they basically don't pay any federal income tax as compared to their wealth. So if you look as a proportion of their wealth or as a proportion of the increase in their wealth over the past 5 years or 10 years, total federal income tax paid by Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or all other billionaires, is a few percent, maybe 1 or 2 or 3% of the total increase in their wealth over this period. So, and the reason is because the income tax in itself is not sufficient to have a fair distribution of the tax burden, because when you have a very high wealth individual, whether you're a US citizen or a Chinese citizen or Russian citizen, your fiscal income, your income for income tax purposes can be said to be a very small fraction of your wealth. So then you can have whatever income tax rate you want. You will have very small tax revenue from these people. And I think the only solution again will be to have some form of wealth tax, which will require the kind of global financial register that I was describing. I am aware that for many people, this looks like complete taboo and completely impossible. But this is also what people thought a century ago, or a little bit more than a century ago, about the possible creation of an income tax in the United States. Many people thought that the sky will fall and the economy will collapse. If we have an income tax system, and in the end, it was a big success. So, I think we should continue in this direction.
Thank you, Professor. I think that everyone will agree that changing times require adaptation. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Piketty has a hard stop at 1:30. So with that, we're going to have to bring the session to a close. Please join me in thanking Dr. Piketty for sharing his insights with us today. And let me also thank the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment team for their constant support. Todd, Nicole, and Mariah, thank you. And I thank the National Defense University leadership for empowering us to succeed, and thank all of you for joining us today. Please stay safe, stay strong, and stay in touch. Professor Piketty, I look forward to corresponding with you in the future. But for now, this is Michael McCloudrick for National Defense University signing off.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Take care, sir.